All right, so in previous lecture, what do we have discussed? We have discussed a income expenditure model. So this is going to help us understand the determination of Y, right? But as I just mentioned, so we look at it Y from demand side. And we have made a bunch of assumption, particularly I want to emphasize. So we assume price, and here's the price, essentially interest rate is fixed. Okay, so those are the assumptions we made. Now in this lecture, what are we going to do? We are going to relax these assumptions. So price is not fixed anymore. We not only look at the demand, we also look at the supply. At the end, so we are going to see the joint determination of price and real GDP. And the way we approach in this lecture is first look at the demand. And then, so we look at supply. Once we understand each side, we are going to bring them together to look at equilibrium. All right, very much similar to demand and supply in microeconomics. Okay, many analyses will be similar. However, the economic mechanism underlying those aggregate demand and aggregate supply will be different, right? So this is a roadmap of this lecture, okay? So we are going to start with aggregate demand curve and then aggregate supply. I want to emphasize, so when we look at aggregate supply, we want to differentiate between short run versus long run. Okay, so this long run, and we are going to start with short run. Short run usually means like a few months. Long run means a few years or decades. Okay, so and then, so you're going to see the aggregate supply will be dramatically different. So once we understand supply and demand separately, we are ready to bring them together. We are going to have aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. So earlier in micro, so we studied demand and supply. Now we are going to look at aggregate demand, aggregate supply. So the benefit of studying this model is that we can understand how government policy, so this includes monetary and fiscal policy, how government policy can help the economy, and particularly to stabilize the economy whenever there's fluctuation. I think about the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, right? So this bailout is going to help to stabilize, to help the further collapse of labor market. And we are in the COVID-19 pandemic. And then the government spending help us to further collapse, right? So like at the beginning of the pandemic, so the unemployment rate at some point hit to 20%. We have tens of millions of people lost their job, right? And the government spent a lot of money, send us check. Okay, so now in these, after this chapter, we are ready to understand what is behind government's decision, right? But certainly everything comes with a cost. There's a trade-off. Okay, so let's start with aggregate demand. Oh, by the way, so those things also help us to understand, to answer the questions, what causes recession? And why inflation high in some recession, but not other, right? Okay. Start with aggregate demand. So this aggregate demand curve looks almost identical to the individual demand curve we studied in micro, but they are different in many ways. Let's go one by one. First, here, so aggregate demand. So we first look at real GDP, because real GDP, again, so we can look at GDP through three aspects, right? expenditure, income, or product. So number. And then, so here, the aggregate price is aggregate price. Meaning we look at the price of a bundle of things. But when we study demand curve in microeconomics, what do we look at? We look at the price of a particular thing, right? So we look at the price of cotton, and then the demand for cotton. We look at price of laptop, the demand for laptop, right? Here, we look at the aggregate price. So this includes the price of the bottled water, the price of the laptop, the price of the house, the price of education, many, many things, right? Also demand is aggregate. So we also have a downward slope, meaning higher the price, lower the aggregate expenditure or real GDP. Lower the price, higher the aggregate expenditure or real GDP. But what is behind that? Okay. To understand the downward slopeness of this aggregate demand. So we need to look at this equation. So we have seen this many times, right? In previous lecture, so we killed these three terms. Now we bring them back, okay? So by examining this equation, so first let's just look at GDP through spending. Okay. Now, what do we need to understand is the following. Sorry, I just go too fast. Why a rise in aggregate price level is going to reduce either C or I or net export? Usually here, G, we say this is a policy instrument. Okay, usually this is the government's choice. Okay, usually it doesn't respond to the price. Okay, and as a matter of fact, so the government may do the opposite, meaning so when price increase, as we see, so the aggregate demand decrease, and then the government may do the opposite, so they are going to increase the spending, right? But anyways, for now, let's just focus on why price increase can potentially lead to C or I or net export decrease. So there are two reasons. Reason number one is wealth effect. Put it simple. Higher price reduce your purchasing power. To give you an example, last year, so at the peak of the pandemic, the gas price went down to $2 per gallon. And this year, so we are in a strong rebound. The gas price easily exceed $3. So what this means to your purchasing power? So for example, we have students who work for a local restaurant, make, I don't know, let's just pretend, say for example, you make $100 per day. Last year, $2 per gallon. With $100, you can easily fill your car, and with maybe $40 or $50, $60 left in your pocket to buy a dinner and do something to pay your bill, right? Now this year, the price went to $3. You still have $100. You fill your gas, and you left very little, right? So that just means your purchasing power decrease, and then you may have less incentive to spend your money. So you're going to watch a movie or to go to a bar. Essentially, because higher price reduce your purchasing power, just eat away the money you have. This is called wealth effect, right? Okay. And in the broader sense, think about the housing market, right? So like last year, the median house costs 250. Now, so in Omaha, it's going to easily cost like 300, and then you cannot get the house. So and then, so if you need a house, you pay for 300 buy a house, you left very little to do other things. That's the wealth effect. Now, the other one is interest rate effect. This one is a little bit difficult to understand. Okay, but there are many ways to explain. So one particular way to understand that is, so if price increase, okay, and then you need more cash or cash reserve to pay your bill, to pay for your dinner, right? Because for example, so last year, so only cost you $30 to pump your guys. Now you need $40. So meaning you need to carry more cash, either in your wallet, like in physical cash, or in your debit card, or use a credit card, right? Now, you need to carry more cash or put more money in your debit card, meaning you have less money. You can do other things like investment, right? So that just means, okay, so higher price will lead to lower investment through the interest rate effect. Okay, or in other words, okay, so you carry more cash, you have less money. So yes, I just read myself, right? So, so this is called interest rate. So these two effects leads to the following: aggregate price increase, and then through the decrease in C or decrease in I, but certainly also decrease in import, because import is what? Essentially, sorry, export is what? Essentially, the foreigner purchase what we produce, right? So then, so that's going to lead to the GDP, this through the lens of demand to decline, right? So actually, so we have a graph to understand that, okay? So this is the income expenditure model we discussed in previous lecture, right? And I want to emphasize or want to remind you. So this model is for a given price level. Given price level, we are going to see an equilibrium. Okay. Now, what happened if we dropped? Okay, let me erase here. What happened if we drop the assumption that price is fixed? And then more specifically, think about what happened if the aggregate price went down. If the aggregate price went down due to the wealth effect and interest rate effect, the aggregate expenditure will move up. So that just means we are going to move from here to here, right? So then furthermore, this means when price decrease, so we are going to move from this equilibrium to the new equilibrium, right? Okay, and then furthermore, so it means let's just put this, because remember here, so they just aggregate spending versus real GDP. Okay? Now we can use a slightly different version. Okay, so on the top, this is our income expenditure model at a given level of price. Now we drop that assumption for a fixed price to see how the price change, right? So if the price decrease, okay, and then so we move from Y1 to Y2. So you see price decrease, we move from Y1 to Y2. Okay, so essentially we just one way to understand is, okay, so you have like animation. Animation is just like play a movie, right? So this movie just, okay, one snapshot of the movie is, okay, so you have one price level, okay? And then so another snapshot is, so you have this price level, all right? And then so we put them together. And then so you can see, so this one corresponds to this dot. This one corresponds to this region, right? Okay, and then so let me clear everything. So essentially, oh, so there's a problem. Anyway, so this is essentially says, right? So this essentially just says, so we are going to see a correlation between price level and the real GDP, right? But again, so this is coming from the income expenditure model we have discussed in previous lecture, right? It looks like identical to the demand curve we studied micro, but underneath that, the mechanism quite different. Make sure you understand that, all right? Right. So in the similarly, so we are going to study the movement along the aggregate demand curve versus shift. But what causes the movement? Simply the price, aggregate price level, right? Okay, this is similar to the individual demand. Now, what causes the curve to shift? So means that just the entire curve shift. Okay? So there are following reasons: expectation, wealth, physical capital, and government policy. Okay. So now let me explain to you how each of these factors cause the shift. Okay, by the way, so just shift means goes here. So increase, that just means the curve shift to the right. Decrease, the curve shift to the left. Movement along the curve, we just keep the curve, we just move along the curve. Right? Now, what caused the shift? Expectation. So if we are expecting the housing market is going to cool down, okay? So that is going to leave for most of the homeowners. That means it reduces wealth. That means a reduced purchasing power. That means reduced consumption. Okay, so there's expectation. Wealth. But I just give you the example of wealth, right? So maybe give you another example of expectation. So if we are worried about the coming recession, or we're not sure about how severe the winter will be, like in terms of pandemic, okay? And then so most likely you want cancel your travel plan, right? Like so recently we bought the tickets for family of 4. We decided to go to Orlando. Okay? And so if the COVID-19 becomes worse or severe than we thought, we may cancel our trip, right? So if we cancel our trip, or if everyone do the same things, and then so the consumption, the aggregate expenditure will decline. Okay, so this expectation. Wealth, I give you example. Now, maybe go back, previous one. So we already discussed expectation, wealth. Okay. So what about the size of existing stock of physical capital? So this actually affect investment. Okay. Think about restaurant. If the restaurant, so their current physical capital just means their square feet. means the tables hasn't been fully utilized because of demand is weak. Or in other words, they have a lot of physical capital. They may not want to add additional physical capital, meaning investment will be low, and meaning the aggregate expenditure or aggregate demand will be low. Okay, so this is the third factor. Now the last factor, government policy. So this includes physical and monetary, right? So we cannot go too much details because we need many preparation. But here I can give you some simple examples. During the pandemic, I believe most of us receive a free check from the government, right? If you're not you, maybe your parents. Okay. So this free check have impact on aggregate demand. Because in some sense, again, so we will see, so in the future, so this is not completely free, just quote unquote free, right? So you will see that in details in the future chapter. But at least this is some money, right? So, and then so you want to spend. So that just says, okay, so by the way, that's part of the physical policy. So the government gives you a cash to spend. So that's going to help aggregate expenditure. This is one example. The other example. So currently the government is talking about increase the tax. But for now, the tax was largely focused on billionaire, right? But even though, so okay, so this increase in tax on billionaire will have impact on those billionaire spending, right? If this is a tax on everyone, and then pretty much everyone will cut their spending because your disposable income will decrease. So that's going to reduce aggregate demand, right? So those government policy, right? So now to summarize, so we have this aggregate demand. So there are factors cause the aggregate demand to increase or decrease, right? Okay, but also we want to differentiate between move along the curve versus shift of the curve, right? And particularly, so at some point it's very difficult to disentangle, okay? So sometimes you see a change in wheels, but these changing wheels can cause you to move along or you shift. It depending on source of changing wheels. Example, if changing price level that affect our wheels, and then so we are going to move along the curve, right? There's nothing else changed. On the other hand, if there's change in something else, like the housing market crash, the only change is the housing market, but not the other goods and service. And then so that just means that changing your wheels, you're going to shift the curve, right? Let me wrap up this part by showing you a practice question. If the economy is in equilibrium and the real estate market collapse, what will likely happen? So first of all, this is going to affect aggregate demand. Is step number one. Number two, so real estate market collapse that reduce your wealth. And number three, so that's going to reduce aggregate demand. Number four, so that means leftward shift, right? So that's the logic how we answer these questions. And the answer is B. right?